It is a real pleasure. I see so many friends in the audience, so thank you so much for Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. I'm Susan Segal. I'm President and CEO of the Americas Society, and it is a great honor for us to be hosting this lunch, which is the second part of our Washington conference. And as Eric and I have talked about, hopefully next year, we will remerge the whole thing into one day. First of all, I want to thank Eric and the rest of the team, Maria. I see Stephanie back from retirement, Jorge, the interns, Karen, who's doing the virtual part of it. I want to thank you all because this takes an amazing amount of work. And again, you guys have just done a spectacular job. So let's give them a round of applause. So I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to introduce our first keynote speaker of the day, IMF Managing Director, Dr. Kristalina Georgieva, and then conduct an interview with her after her initial remarks. As all of you know, the IMF has played an outsized role in helping to maintain the financial health and well-being of the hemisphere. And this isn't just something that is happening today. I started working with the IMF in 1982 during the original debt crisis, and their commitment and the IMF's commitment to financial stability and growth in Latin America has just been outstanding over so many years. The institution today is particularly relevant as the region continues to recover from the brutal COVID pandemic, which hit Latin America, as we all know, harder than many other regions in the world. And as we look to a period of elections with new leaders throughout the hemisphere, and as we look at some of the many economic challenges in some of the countries in the hemisphere, their role will continue to be so important, not just to Latin America, but to Latin America's stability and economic growth and the peoples of the hemisphere. I previously had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Georgieva, whose biography information is in your luncheon program. I found her to be an active listener, an incisive questioner, and a decisive practitioner of global financial affairs. She's pragmatic, and I think that is particularly important in today's world. She is truly one of the best with a heart for Latin America, and we are privileged to have her with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, the Managing Director of the IMF, Dr. Kristalina Georgieva.
Thank you very much, Susan. Very warm introduction, and one that my colleagues from the IMF and I value because it is indeed a reflection of the strong connections we have with Latin America and also the very good personal relations we have with you. We are in a beautiful room. I have never been in the Ben Franklin room. I don't know about you, but I think it is perfect because it has this view towards the south, and of course this is exactly where the topic of our conversation is. Let me start from the global context. I became managing director of the IMF in October 2019. Just months after I stepped into the job, the world was hit by COVID. 2020, high uncertainty, very dramatic conditions in many countries, and for us at the fund, time to step up swiftly and provide massive financial support to our members, as well as, even more important than the financial support, provide a clear diagnostics of what is going on and how we can deal with it. 2021, we were turning towards recovery, and then the war in Ukraine started. Yet another massive shock that has caused, as you very well know, tremendous negative impact, especially through an energy shock on the world economy. 2022, we got the combined impact of COVID and the war through price dynamics into a massive jump in inflation, leading to, of course, appropriate monetary policy, meaning interest rates went much higher quite sharply. In October this year, we had our annual meetings, 2023, so we are sitting there, and I was thinking, oh, God, please, let 23 be a year of no surprises. But unfortunately, I was proven wrong. And as you know, there is a very significant development in the Middle East that so far has not translated into a massive wave affecting the world economy, but is devastating in the epicenter of the war, very risky for the immediate neighborhood, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, and as I'm sure you're seeing, with repercussions in terms of possible spillovers, not only in the neighborhood in terms of war, but throughout the world in terms of the ugly head of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia popping up. So our global, why I'm starting from here, because our global context these days is the economy being affected by exogenous shocks. For the first time, we are talking about pain that doesn't come from the traditional source of mismanaging our financial system, but it comes from pandemic, war, and geopolitical tensions. What does that mean? Well, first, the good news. We have seen remarkable resilience, especially here in the United States, that has sustained growth projected to be this year around 3%. Bad news. 3% this year, but also we are expecting 3% next year, the year after, and the year after. In other words, weak growth for years to come. Just as a historical comparison, growth was 3.8% in average in the previous decade. With the inflation being this also resilient beast, we have to maintain central bank interventions. In other words, interest rates stay higher for longer, and they throw cold water on what is already anemic growth. My big concern is for countries that have very high debt levels, because obviously the longer interest rates stay high, the tougher it would be for countries to manage it. And one very interesting observation from our annual meetings, this time the conversation was less about monetary policy and inflation, it was much more about fiscal risks and the fact that finance authorities are being pressured to still do more for the green transition, for digitalization, to protect vulnerable people, to rebuild buffers that have been exhausted during this crisis, and do so while continuing to protect their debt sustainability in countries that have problems. Now, turning to Latin America and the Caribbean, Isabel Allende from Chile, she said, "We don't even know how strong we are until we are forced to bring this hidden strength forward." And since we are in the State Department, I cannot resist quoting Madeleine Albright that women are like, no, sorry, Roosevelt, for saying that women are like tea bags. We don't know how strong we are until we are put in hot water. Latin America is in hot water, and Latin America has shown that it can handle these shocks. My huge respect, especially for the countries in Latin America that have been ahead of the curve to deal with inflation. Brazil, just to name one. If we exclude Venezuela and Argentina, and I see the ambassador of Argentina, I would have liked to note, but if we exclude Venezuela and Argentina, we are talking about inflation declining in Latin America from 7.8% in 22 to 5% this year, and to around 3.5% next year. And I certainly hope we will see the same trend in Argentina, Ambassador. Maybe not the same numbers, but the same trajectory. What we are concerned about, though, looking at Latin America, is that the problem of weak growth is demonstrably very present. We see GDP growth slowing from about 4% in 22 to 2.3% this year, 2.3% next year. Largely, why? Because of unsupportive external conditions. We can call this a necessary slowdown, but if you look in the medium term, our worries are about projected growth of 2.5%, way below what is necessary to lift up living standards in the region. So what can be done? Obviously, it's all good to throw our hands in the air, but what can we do? Since you called me pragmatic, I have to earn this now. I think the importance of the most important lesson from the COVID applies here as well. And what was the most important lesson? Countries with strong fundamentals, strong policies, and strong institutions weathered the shock much better, like people with strong immune systems. And therefore, as trivial as it may be, we do want to see the region continuing to be very focused on monetary policy that brings inflation where it has to be, and to be very vigilant about financial stability risks, and prepare for future shocks. If there is one lesson from the first years of this decade, the lesson is we are in a more shock-prone world. I'm very grateful to countries that have seen the role of the fund more in preventing shocks from hitting them than in responding to shocks. Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, they have flexible credit lines with the fund, a buffer, so if there is a shock, they can absorb it on that basis. And I would certainly encourage countries to use that access to that flexible credit line if they're eligible. On the fiscal side, as I said, we are now more worried about the fiscal situation. I want to say it as loudly, as clearly as I can. At the IMF, we do want countries to be disciplined, but it doesn't mean tighten your belt, cut spending. We actually are much more interested to see prudent revenue-raising policies. We want to see those that can pay taxes to actually do so. And then, of course, to improve the quality of public spending, because, like it or not, it is a tough time ahead of us. When it comes down to medium-term growth, there is no way around it. There have to be reforms that make economies perform better and compete better. Education. You don't have the skills, you don't have the talents in this world, you're in trouble. It's a royal mess if you don't have it. Business climate. Let's face it, there is still a lot that can be done to ease conditions. Many of you here, how many are business people here? Raise your hand. So, you know it, you know. And there you can work with us, because we do work closely with countries to help them clear the pathway with more predictable regulation, with tax frameworks that are transparent, and of course, putting public investments where it would make a difference, in connectivity, in logistics, in infrastructure critical for the economy to perform. Secondly, and you know it very well, crime. We can't have Latin America succeed if that is not handled. And I am very convinced that the economics of anti-crime is obvious. Rodrigo gave a great interview to the Financial Times about our new research in this area. If we bring crime down to the world average, not better, that could increase a growth rate in the region by 0.5 percentage point. When we are struggling for every tiny increase in growth, we obviously have to grab that. And my last area is trade. This region is unfortunately falling behind other similar regions by a long margin. Trade within the region is 40 to 50% lower than in similar regions. So obviously, logistics, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, infrastructure, they are essential. And it would boost trade and growth, but it also would reduce the impact of fragmentation on the region. Everywhere I go, people recognize fragmentation is for real. It is happening. So how do they defend themselves? ASEAN, increase collaboration within ASEAN. And I think Latin America has to think in that same mode. We are not going to go easily back to the world of yesterday, but in the world of tomorrow, there is more that can be done within regions to get the economies booming. I want to finish by saying that for us at the IMF, our commitment to Latin America is unwavering. I didn't know it. Susan, thank you for inviting me. So I learned a very interesting fact. Since 1952, 1/3 of IMF lending went to Latin America, where only 1/10 of the world population lives. And of course, it is not the quantity, it is the quality. When we are, like we recently did in Barbados, when we can support transformation, and obviously you would say, hey, Barbados, do it. Ambassador would say, do it with Argentina. We have to be ambitious to make the quality of our engagement pay off for people and businesses in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those insightful comments. There's so many, questions to ask you, but let's start on something that you mentioned. First of all, let me commend you, because for the first time I've really heard a managing director of the IMF not just talk about the micro problems and the fiscal, but the whole macro situation of where is the region going, and that is so important to be able to put all the pieces together. You talked about trade, and this morning we talked about, at this point I don't know if it was Brian or Rodrigo that mentioned that inter-Latin American trade is so small compared to other regions in the world. So how can we change that? How can the IMF use its influence to help encourage encourage Latin American countries to engage in trade between themselves? Because if they do that, they'll increase growth.
This is a point when we completely agree, and we put, in a sense, our beliefs where our mouth is. When we engage with countries in Latin America, we do prioritize what they can do on the policy front and what they can do on the investment front to encourage more trade within the region. I said that before I finished. What we are seeing in the world today is the forces of fragmentation causing significant impact on economies around the world. We calculated that just trade fragmentation could lead over medium term to somewhere between 0.2% and 7% of GDP loss. To make it visible, 7% of GDP, this is Germany and Japan disappearing from the economic map of the world. Now, obviously, we have to be prudent to accept first that some fragmentation is inevitable, Susan, because what both the pandemic and the wars taught us is that security of supplies is an economic issue. It is not just, it is of course national security issue, but it is also an economic issue. If supply chains break, that has significant consequences. So some redundancy in how we build supply chains is a necessity, but it has to be done thoughtfully, not willy-nilly, you destroy it. And that opens up an opportunity because of this realignment of supply chains for countries that are proactive, that put their policies in good order and put their public money as well as how they attract private money in good order to be the beneficiaries. Mexico is one country that always comes into these conversations because it's so close to the United States. But even in Mexico, we are not completely convinced that everything is being done to take advantage of realignment of supply chains. So if you are in China and you say, well, I don't want to be in China anymore, I want to be closer to a market, what would you look for? You would look for the same things that are in China: excellent infrastructure, efficient logistics systems. And if you are in Latin America and you know that you trade with each other via Miami, you probably have to figure out how to trade with each other, not going to Miami. And that would be, I mean, our engagement with countries is to say, let's put a plan that is implementable, that is pragmatic, and then measure progress on the basis of increasing interregional trade. And Rodrigo can tell you more about what we do, but if countries fail to adjust to the new world, you remember last decade? We don't want that to happen again. And I have one particular issue with Latin America, which is language proficiency. Obviously, you have the region has huge advantage vis-a-vis Spanish-speaking and some Portuguese-speaking countries that has been deployed. And the question is how to make it so that English becomes a normal second language that is being utilized in a world where the new technologies are pushing digital trade as the only part of trade that is vibrant and growing.
So you mentioned infrastructure, and that's critical because you can't have trade among Latin American countries if you don't have infrastructure and connectivity. And that's both physical and digital.
Yep.
Can you comment on that? And also comment on the fact that you work with individual countries as opposed to necessarily the region as a whole in terms of incentivization. As you think about the IMF in the future,
Yep.
as you think about Latin America, is there a way that you can work with all of the countries together to try to make this happen?
Excellent questions. On the infrastructure side, we actually know it from centuries of experience. A country that is lower income becomes higher income on the basis of three things. Infrastructure, today that involves also digital infrastructure, education, competent labor force, and rule of law. You have only two of those, don't have the third, whichever one is the third, you cannot really speed up and pull yourself out of, in many cases, middle income status, you kind of get into this middle income trap. On digital infrastructure, what we are really hoping to see is that the region acts as in a much more integrated manner, rather than country by country by country. And I think you're right to say to us at the fund, you guys also need to to expand and work in regional context. The way we do it is we have our products that are regional, in which we look, our analysis is across countries. We have been partnering with the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank now much more on 3 topics: climate, digital, and debt. And you would see us coming with much more of a strategic alignment in which what the fund does on the digital side is digital money, what happens in the CBDC world, what happens in the world of privately issued digital money. And then B, you would see us in pushing digital as a transformative force, tax. You know, I know that this is not popular. Many countries try not to put everything online, but unless you do it, you have the other problems. In the world of politeness, this problem is called leakage. In the world of Jim Wolfenson, it's called corruption, and it's called cancer. So we have to use, what we want is to deploy our skills and our engagement to move that. And then we have a very important role to play through our capacity development, in which we do serve as a transmission line of experience from one place to another. We have regional centers, training centers, and they're very popular. And I can tell you, I would beg you to actually lobby for us to have this money, because why get everybody to learn on their own inefficiently when we can all learn together?
Absolutely. I mean, this is the opportunity, and it probably translates into a much higher percentage of growth in Latin America, no?
Of course.
So in a diverse region like Latin America, what lessons can we learn from your interactions with the hemisphere?
This is really a very diverse region. I think there are 3 lessons we learned through our many decades of engagement. The first one is that there is no substitute for country ownership of policy reforms. You can take a horse to water, you cannot make the horse drink. And that engagement with countries, we are now much more, I actually, just before coming here, I had a meeting with our director for capacity development, and we talked exactly about the role of political economy, and that we cannot only have our traditional macroeconomists, fiscal monetary policy. We need to have political economy experts that can help countries to navigate reforms in a more effective manner. The second lesson we learned is that reforms are reversible. And that is, we cannot take it for granted that if a country is here, it will stay here and will continue to climb up. So that, again, goes into engaging the business community, to put pressure for sustaining this path to reform. And the third thing we learned is that we can generate really fantastic examples of success. We have at the fund, as a very conservative organization, an obsession with our, shall we say, less successful experiences. And I, as a managing director, I want the fund to be much more of a cheerleader for success, because success breeds success. We know what failure is, an orphan. Nobody wants to own it. And that, I think, and of course we have experiences with very successful countries, like we used to lend to Brazil. Brazil used to be a client of the fund. No more, because Brazil has built a very strong institutional fabric and policies. We have countries that are actually coming to the fund smartly for precautionary arrangements, something we just revamped. Great, actually, just to give you one more sort of marketing point here. You look at reserves, and you have situations in which countries build huge reserves to protect themselves against shocks. All very good, but reserves are expensive. So how can countries use the fund as an insurer that adds to their own efforts. So a line of defense that makes the overall cost of protection of the economy lower. And my favorite story of recent time is how the region helped the fund to step up. The Caribbean, very vulnerable to climate shocks, the Caribbean countries pushed us to embrace both climate risks and the transition to low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. And today, I can say, as a result of that, the IMF is systemically significant institution in the fight against climate change. We engage on the policy front, and we have a $40 billion strong financial instrument to help, long-term financial instrument to help our members.
I think we have to end. Is that right, Maria?
Yes, it's 1.
It's 1 o'clock. So I want to thank you, Madam Managing Director, for this very, very insightful conversation. I think we'll have to continue it because this is so important to the stability of Latin America and growth. And frankly, we didn't even get to talk about IFE reform and what that means for the IMF or anything else.
Give me 20 seconds.
20 seconds you have.
Yesterday, our board voted for 50% increase of our quota resources. In a geopolitically very difficult time, we managed to bring the membership together. Next, we have to shift more towards countries that are underrepresented. And I can tell you that I take this with great gusto because financially strong fund, now we can say check, has to be also legitimate fund. So stay tuned, more to come.
Well, thank you again very much. I want you to note that a woman got through consensus in the IMF, and therefore I think we should send her on a tour around the world to many other places. Thank you so much again.